The morning Elias Croft found the woman in the woods, the Sierra Nevada mountains were draped in a silence so complete it felt like the world itself was holding its breath. It was the autumn of 1872, when the railroad had already sliced through the belly of California like a wound that never quite healed, scattering men and money and broken promises across the golden landscape. Elias had been a mountain man for 11 years by then, living in the high country above the Yuba River Valley, far enough from the noise of Sacramento and the dirt of the mining camps to feel like himself. He was 31 years old, broad as a barn door, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buckskin jacket and forearms, thick as the pine branches he split each morning for firewood. His hair was the color of dark honey, grown long enough to brush his collar, and he kept a short beard that did nothing to soften the hard line of his jaw. He was not a man who smiled easily, but when he did, it changed his entire face, the way a sudden crack of sunlight can transform a gray mountain valley into something that looks almost holy. He had come down from his cabin to check his traps along the eastern ridge that morning, his boots crunching through the first frost of the season, his breath rising in white clouds before him. He carried his rifle on his back and a skinning knife at his hip, and he moved through the trees with the easy, unhurried confidence of a man who understood the wilderness the way other men understood city streets, every sound and shadow and shift of wind communicating something to him that words would never quite capture. He heard her before he saw her. It was not a cry exactly, more like the sound a wounded animal makes when it has already given up on calling for help and has settled instead into the quiet business of enduring. A low, controlled exhale of pain, repeated at intervals, and then a rustle of leaves, and then silence, and then again that sound. He stopped walking. He stood motionless for a full 30 seconds, listening, letting the forest tell him what it knew. Then he turned from the trail and moved through the trees toward the sound, his hand resting on the handle of his knife. She was sitting at the base of a ponderosa pine, her back against the bark, her right leg extended before her at an angle that made something cold move through Elias's chest. She was Chinese, perhaps 23 or 24 years old, wearing a dark blue cotton jacket over a lighter inner garment, both of them torn and muddied and dark with what he recognized immediately as dried blood. Her black hair had come loose from its arrangement and fell around her face in tangled curtains. Her face itself was extraordinary, even crumpled with pain and exhaustion as it was, high cheekbones and a strong jaw, and eyes that were so dark they seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. Those eyes found him the instant he stepped into her line of sight, and they did not flinch. That was the first thing that struck him. She was clearly in agony, clearly alone, clearly lost in the high country with an injured leg and no obvious means of survival, and yet the eyes she turned on him held no panic. They held pain and wariness and something that might have been a carefully managed version of despair, but they did not beg, and they did not break. "I am not going to hurt you," Elias said, and he kept his voice very low and very steady, the same voice he used with injured animals, because he understood instinctively that the tone mattered more than the words. She said nothing for a moment. Then, in English that was precise and deliberate, she said, "I know you are not. If you intended harm, you would not have announced yourself." He blinked. He had not expected that, the clarity of her reasoning, the composure of it. He crouched down a few feet from her so that he was at her level and looked at the leg. Even through the fabric he could see the swelling, and the way she had it positioned told him a great deal. "How long have you been out here?" he asked. "Since yesterday morning," she said. "I fell crossing the creek bed at the ridge. The stones were iced over." She paused. "I believe the ankle is broken." "I believe you are right," he said. He looked at her face again. "You came from the camp?" A flicker of something passed across her expression. "From Sacramento," she said. "I was traveling with a group. We became separated." There was more to that story. He could see it plainly, but he did not press. He had no right to press, and besides, the pressing thing right now was not her history, but her ankle, and the fact that the temperature had dropped 15 degrees since sunrise and would drop 15 more before nightfall. He shrugged off his pack and opened it, pulling out the blanket he always carried, and he crossed the distance between them and draped it around her shoulders without asking permission, because some things did not require permission. She accepted it with a small nod and pulled it tighter. My name is Lin Mei, she said. Lin is my family name. Elias Croft, he said. He was already fashioning a rough splint from two straight branches he had spotted nearby, tearing strips from the bottom of his own shirt because he had nothing else clean enough. This is going to hurt, he told her honestly. I will be as quick as I can. I have endured pain before, she said, and something in the way she said it made him look up at her face for a moment. She met his gaze evenly. I expect you have, he said quietly. He worked quickly and competently because 11 years in the mountains had made him a practical man when it came to injuries, and because her controlled breathing and the whiteness of her knuckles against her palm told him that every second he took was a second she was fighting very hard to remain composed. When it was done, he sat back and looked at the result, and then at her face. She was pale, and her jaw was clenched, but her eyes were dry. My cabin is about 2 miles north, he said. There is no trail that will allow you to walk it on that ankle. I am going to carry you. If that is not acceptable to you, I understand. But those are the options as I see them. If you have a better idea, I will hear it. She considered this with a gravity that he found oddly moving. 2 miles, she said. In your estimation, how long will that take at carrying pace? 45 minutes, perhaps a little more, he said. The terrain is manageable. She looked at him with those dark, measuring eyes for a moment, taking in the breadth of his shoulders and the easy, settled way he occupied the space around him. Then we should go before the light changes, she said. He lifted her with a care that surprised even himself. He was a man accustomed to hauling elk carcasses and timber beams, to moving through the world with force and certainty, but he gathered her up as though she were made of something precious, one arm beneath her knees and one behind her back, and he adjusted his footing on the uneven ground before he moved. She held herself very still in his arms, one hand gripping the front of his jacket for balance, and she made no sound the entire way back, even though he could feel, through the tension in her body, exactly what it was costing her. He talked because the silence felt too loud, and because he thought it might help her concentrate on something other than the pain. He told her about the mountains, about the way the animals prepared for winter, about the particular blue of the sky above the tree line on a clear October morning. He did not know why he talked about these things. He was not, by nature, a talkative man. But something about carrying her through the trees he loved and describing them to her felt natural and right in a way he could not have explained. She listened. And once, when he paused, she said, "The trees here are very old." And the way she said it, with a kind of respectful quiet, made him look at her sideways and feel something shift in the region of his chest. The cabin came into view through the trees just as the shadow line crossed the eastern meadow, the golden afternoon light retreating up the slope like a slow tide going out. It was a solid, well-built structure, chinked logs and a good cedar-shake roof, with a stone chimney and a covered porch and a wood pile that reached nearly to the eaves. It was a mountain man's cabin, functional and spare, and it had never looked to Elias quite as small as it did at this particular moment. He set her carefully on the porch bench and unlocked the door, then came back and helped her inside and settled her on the cot near the stove. He had the fire going within minutes and a pot of water heating, and he turned to find her looking around the interior of the cabin with that same careful attention she had given everything else, missing nothing. There were shelves of supplies along one wall, dried meat and beans and flour, a row of traps, tools, a good rifle on its rack. There was a work table with a half-finished piece of furniture on it, one of his projects, a chair he had been carving from a single piece of walnut wood because the long winter evenings needed filling somehow. There was a bookshelf, smaller than the supply shelves, but thoughtfully arranged, holding perhaps 30 volumes, everything from a battered almanac to a copy of Dickens to 3 volumes of natural history. She looked at the books longest. "You read," she said. "I do," he said. "So do I," she said, and it sounded like the opening of a door. He made a proper splint that evening, having cleaned and examined the ankle by the light of 2 oil lamps. It was a clean break, as clean as such things could be, and she would be off it for at least 3 weeks if she wanted it to heal properly. He told her this with the same straightforwardness he used about everything, and she received it with the same composure with which she received everything. 3 weeks, she said. "At minimum," he said. "More like 5 or 6 before it is fully reliable." He paused. "You are welcome here for as long as you need to be." She looked at him. There was something in the look that he could not quite categorize, something that was neither gratitude nor wariness, but contained elements of both and something else besides. "You do not know anything about me," she said. "I know you survived a night in the Sierra Nevada in October with a broken ankle," he said, "and that your English is better than most of the men I have met in the past decade, and that you were carrying no food and no weapon, and yet you were not screaming when I found you." He considered. "That tells me quite a lot, actually." The ghost of something passed across her face that was very nearly a smile. "You are observant," she said. "Mountains teach you to be," he said. That first night she slept on his cot, and he slept rolled in blankets on the floor, and he lay awake for a long time, listening to the fire settle and the wind move in the pines outside, and thinking about the particular way she had looked at his bookshelf. In the morning, he made cornmeal porridge and coffee, and she ate with a focused, grateful attention that told him she had not eaten since before her fall. She told him a little more of her story over the next several days, piece by piece, the way a cautious person shares something precious, making sure at each step that the ground is solid before taking the next. Her parents had come from Guangdong province to California. In 1851, during the gold rush, her father, among the tens of thousands of Chinese men who had answered the call of Gamsan, Gold Mountain, and found instead backbreaking labor and racial hostility and laws designed specifically to keep him from succeeding. He had stayed nonetheless because he had a wife and a daughter and no better option, and he had worked the laundry trade in Sacramento while her mother took in sewing, and together they had built something that resembled, from certain angles, a life. Lin Mei had been born in Sacramento in 1849 and had grown up straddling two worlds, schooled partly by a mission teacher who had seen her intelligence and refused to waste it, and partly by her mother, who had taught her the classical Chinese texts she had memorized as a girl in Guangdong. By the time she was 20, she could read and write in both English and Chinese, could do arithmetic faster than most men twice her age, and had a mind that her mother described, with equal parts pride and apprehension, as sharp enough to cut glass. Her parents had died the previous winter, her father first of pneumonia, and her mother 6 weeks later of what the neighbors called grief, and the doctor called a bad heart. And Lin Mei had been left alone in a city that had very little use for a young Chinese woman with no family and too much education and not enough money. She had been traveling to Grass Valley, she told Elias, because a woman there, a former employer of her mother's, had offered her work as a seamstress. She had been trying to save the cost of the stage fare and had accepted a ride with a group of men who had seemed respectable enough in Sacramento and who had become considerably less so once they were several hours from the city. She stopped there. She looked at the fire. She did not tell him what had happened that had resulted in her being alone in the mountains with no pack and no food and a broken ankle, and Elias did not ask because he already understood the shape of it and because the anger it produced in him was the kind that needed very careful management. "You are safe here," he said, and he said it with a quiet certainty that was not a comfort offered but a fact stated. She looked at him then, and this time the thing in her expression was clearer. "I believe you," she said. The weeks that followed had a quality that Elias had no good word for, a kind of dailiness that was both ordinary and extraordinary at once, each morning and evening specific and unrepeatable, in a way that he found himself thinking about long after it had passed. She was a more efficient person than he was, he discovered quickly, which startled him, because he had always prided himself on his efficiency. But where he moved through his routines with a solid, unhurried competence, she moved with a precision that eliminated every unnecessary motion, so that the same task performed by Lin Mei took 2/3 the time it took him. She organized his shelves on the third day, politely but definitively, rearranging things according to a logic that he could not immediately follow, but that revealed itself as strikingly sensible within a week. "You knew where everything was before," he pointed out, not irritated, genuinely curious. "I knew where everything was," she agreed. "Now you will also know where everything is, even when your mind is elsewhere." He laughed. It was the first time she had heard him laugh properly, a real laugh, low and surprised, and she looked at him with an expression he could not quite read before looking back at what she was doing. She read 3 of his books in the first 2 weeks, borrowing them from the shelf with a formality that acknowledged them as his property, returning them precisely where she had found them. When she returned the Dickens, she set it down and said, "He is very sentimental about poverty." Elias looked up from the trap he was repairing. "Is that a criticism?" "An observation," she said. "Sentiment about poverty is easier to feel from outside it." He thought about that for a long time. "You are not wrong," he said. She was not a woman who was easily impressed, he learned, and because of that, the things that did impress her carried a particular weight. When she watched him work the walnut chair, her eyes followed his hands with a focused attention that was not quite admiration, but was something close to it. He was not an artist by any description he would have given himself, but he had taught himself cabinetry from a single battered manual and 11 years of practice, and the chair had a clean elegance to it that came from something more than technique. "Who taught you this?" she asked one evening. "A book and stubbornness," he said. She smiled at that. It was, he had come to understand, a real smile, which was different from the polite arrangement of her features she sometimes produced when she did not wish to appear unfriendly. The real smile reached all the way to those dark eyes of hers, and it did something to the air in the room that he could not explain, except by saying that the room became more fully itself when she smiled in it. He did not tell her any of this, obviously. He was not a man given to declarations. He had been raised by a taciturn New England father and a mother who had died when he was 7, and he had come west at 19 because the East had felt airless and small, and he had lived alone in these mountains for 11 years because solitude was the only condition under which he had ever felt entirely himself. He knew all of this about himself with perfect clarity, and yet something was happening in this small cabin that his self-knowledge had not prepared him for. It was not a sudden thing. It was not the lightning bolt variety of story that other men told in saloons, sudden love and instant certainty. It was more like the way spring comes to the high country, slowly, incrementally, small signs that you might dismiss individually, but that accumulate until one morning you look up and the meadow is green, and you cannot say exactly when it happened. He noticed, for instance, that he came back from his morning rounds faster than he used to. That he looked forward to breakfast in a way that had nothing to do with food. That when she said something particularly acute, which was often, he found himself smiling as he went about his work in a way that he caught himself at and could not entirely account for. She noticed things too, although she said less about them. She noticed that he was gentler than he appeared, that the same hands that could hew timber could also carve the fine detail work in a walnut chair, back with a patience and delicacy that seemed to come from somewhere deep and private in him. She noticed that he read the same passages of natural history more than once, not because he had forgotten them, but because he took pleasure in the language itself. She noticed that when a small bird struck the cabin window and lay stunned in the snow, he picked it up and held it cupped in his enormous hands, not doing anything in particular, simply providing warmth until it collected itself and flew away, and that he watched it go with an expression she found very difficult to look at and very difficult to look away from. On the 19th day, she took her first proper steps on the healed ankle, testing it carefully under his watchful eye, and it held. She walked to the window and looked out at the mountain slope and the tree line and the cold blue sky, and she stood there for a long time without speaking. "You could stay until the first heavy snow," he said from across the room. He was making an effort to sound neutral and believed he was mostly succeeding. "The trail to Grass Valley will be better in spring." She turned from the window. "You live here alone," she said, and it was not exactly a question. "I do," he said. Why? He thought about giving her the short answer, the one he gave other people, about preferring the mountains to the towns, about finding his own company sufficient. He found that he could not give her that answer. She had been in this cabin with him for 19 days, and she had seen too much of him for the short answer to fit. "Because I had not found a reason to do otherwise," he said. She looked at him for a long, still moment. Then she said, "I think the ankle will be fully reliable by spring, if the offer stands until then." "The offer stands," he said, and he said it very quietly. That evening she sat on the porch bench wrapped in blankets while he split wood in the fading light, and she watched him work. He was, objectively, an extraordinary sight in motion, all that contained power, moving with a precision and economy that the task did not technically require, but that was simply his way. the way a thoroughbred moves differently from a draft horse, even when pulling the same load. She was aware that she was watching him, and she was aware of what the watching meant, and she was cautious about it in the way she was cautious about everything, carefully, deliberately, examining each feeling from multiple angles before she allowed herself to feel it fully. But she allowed this one. She let herself look at Elias Croft splitting wood in the October dusk, and she let herself feel what she felt, and what she felt was something warm and complicated and not at all frightening, which itself surprised her, because warmth had not felt safe for a very long time. November arrived and buried the mountain in white. The first real snowfall came overnight, and by morning the world outside the cabin windows had been transformed into something almost painfully beautiful. The pine trees draped in heavy white, the meadow unmarked, the sky the particular pale gold of a cold, clear morning. Elias went out early and returned with a deer that he had tracked through the fresh snow, and he dressed it in the yard and hung the portions to freeze in the lean-to, with the calm efficiency of a man for whom the violence of survival has long since ceased to be disturbing. Lin Mei made something that evening that she had not made before, a clear soup with dried mushrooms and ginger that she had found in his supplies and spices that she had asked him to bring back from his last supply run to the small trading post 12 miles down the mountain. The smell of it filled the cabin with something that felt like warmth itself, made physical, and when Elias tasted it, he set down his spoon and looked at her across the table. "This is the best thing I have eaten in 11 years, he said. She raised an eyebrow. "That is a low bar given what you have been eating," she said, but her eyes were bright. "I mean it," he said, and his voice was serious enough that she did not deflect again, only looked at her bowl with a small private smile. The long winter evenings arranged themselves into a pattern. After supper he would work at the table, mending or carving or tending tools, and she would read or sew, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they sat in a silence that had none of the emptiness of loneliness in it. She had an endless supply of observations about the books on his shelf, each one unexpected, each one said with a directness that he found bracing and wonderful in equal measure. She told him about her father's work in the laundry, about the specific chemical burn of the lye on the hands after a 12-hour day, about the way her father had come home in the evenings with his hands wrapped and still found the energy to teach her characters by lamplight. She told him about her mother's sewing, how her mother could reproduce any garment she had seen once from memory, how the quality of her work had been indistinguishable from the work of the finest dressmakers in Sacramento, and how she had been paid a fraction of what those dressmakers earned. When she said this last thing, her voice was level, but her jaw was tight, and Elias, watching her, felt the anger rise in him again on her behalf and on behalf of people he had never met. He had grown up knowing injustice the way you know the weather, as a fact of existence, and he had the typical mountain man's deep distrust of institutions and lawmakers. But sitting across from Lin Mei and hearing the shape of her family's life laid out in her clear, restrained voice, he felt the injustice of it with a particular sharp clarity. "Your parents worked harder than most men I have known," he said, "and were treated worse than most men I have known. That is not a coincidence, and it is not right." She looked at him. Something in his face seemed to matter to her. "No," she said quietly, "it is not. This territory will not always be what it is now," he said, and he was not sure if he believed it or only wished it, but he said it because she deserved to hear it said by someone. She held his gaze for a moment, then looked back at her sewing. "Tell me about the mountains," she said. "Tell me something you have never told anyone." He thought about it. "There is a lake," he said, "above the tree line, about a day's walk from here. In July, when the snow is melted off the rock above it, the water is such a particular shade of blue-green that I have never found a word for it. I went up there once and sat on the shore for 3 days because I could not bring myself to leave." He paused. "I have never told anyone that. I always said I was checking the upper country." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I would like to see that lake." "In July," he said, "I will take you." The words were out before he had thought about them, an assumption about the future that he had not intended to make aloud, and he felt the heat of it rise in his face, which was a new and not entirely comfortable experience for Elias Croft. He looked at the piece of wood he was working on with unnecessary focus. Across the table, Lin Mei was also paying her sewing more attention than it strictly required, but she was smiling. December came. Then January, deep and cold and complete, the kind of winter that the Sierra Nevada does at its most absolute, weeks where the temperature did not rise above freezing even at midday, and the snow on the cabin roof was 3 feet deep, and the world beyond the tree line became entirely theoretical. They were snowed in for a stretch of 11 days in January, and the cabin, which had never felt crowded to Elias before, felt exactly the right size. They played cards. She taught him a Chinese game played with tiles that she fashioned from pieces of flat wood and marked with a small knife, the rules of which were considerably more complex than he initially appreciated, and at which she beat him thoroughly for 2 weeks before he began to understand the deeper strategy. He taught her a card game his father had taught him. She mastered it in 3 sessions. They cooked together, a collaboration that was initially awkward because they had different instincts about the sequence of operations and the management of heat, and then became effortless, a kind of domestic fluency that neither of them commented on directly. He learned that she took her coffee without sugar, and that she had a profound and specific fondness for pine nuts, which he made a point of stocking thereafter. She learned that he had nightmares sometimes, not often, but sometimes, and that on those mornings he was quieter than usual, and that what he needed was simply the presence of another person going about ordinary things without comment or inquiry. She provided this. Without being asked, without making it evident that she was providing it, she simply continued to exist in the cabin on those mornings with a warm, unhurried attention that settled something in him that the nightmares disturbed. He was not sure she knew that he knew what she was doing. He suspected she knew perfectly well. One evening in late January, he was mending a harness by the fire when he looked up and found her watching him with an expression that was not her usual careful composition. She was looking at him the way he felt himself looking at her sometimes when he thought she was not paying attention, openly, without the protective layer of neutrality. And when their eyes met, she did not look away. He set down the harness. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved through the pines with a low, persistent sound, like something breathing. "Lin Mei," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "Yes?" "Yes," she said, which was not an answer to a question he had asked, but was somehow an answer nonetheless. He crossed the cabin. He was very aware of the size of himself and the smallness of the distance between them, and he stopped an arm's length away and said, "I am not a man who is good at saying things directly when they matter." "You are actually quite direct," she said. "I mean this particular kind of thing," he said. She looked up at him. The firelight was on her face and her eyes were very dark and very steady. "Then say it anyway," she said, "and I will help you if you get lost." He breathed out. "I think about you," he said, "all the time, not in a way I know what to do with. I've been alone a long time and I thought I knew what I preferred, and then you came into these woods and I do not know anything about what I prefer anymore, except that whatever it is includes you." He stopped. He felt as exposed as the high ridge in January, completely without cover. "That's all I know how to say." She stood up. She was much shorter than he was, the top of her head at his chin, and she looked up at his face for a moment with those eyes that saw everything. Then she put one hand against his chest, over his heart, and she said, "I hear you," and the words had a weight in them that meant more than their face value. He covered her hand with his. His hand was enormous against hers, calloused and scarred from a decade of mountain work, and hers was small and precise and warm, and the feeling of it under his palm was something he was not sure he had a category for. He felt her pulse through her wrist. He wondered if she could feel his. "I'm not easy to know," she said quietly. "I have been careful for a long time." "I'm patient," he said, and he was. He had waited out mountain winters and river floods and the long silence of the high country. He could be patient for Lin Mei. She was quiet for a moment, her hand still pressed against his chest. Then she said very softly, "I think I have been waiting to feel safe before I could feel anything else. I think I may feel safe." He very carefully put his arms around her, slowly enough that she could choose otherwise, and when she did not, she leaned into him, and he held her in the firelight of his mountain cabin in January 1873, and thought that he had not known before this moment what the word shelter actually meant. They moved carefully into the new thing that had opened between them, the way you move in new snow, testing the ground, feeling for what holds. There were no grand declarations after that first evening. There did not need to be. What happened instead was smaller and more permanent, 1,000 small adjustments that reshaped the grammar of their shared days. The way he made sure the chair nearest the fire was always clear for her in the evenings. The way she set aside the best of whatever she cooked for him without comment. The way their hands found each other sometimes when they sat together reading. The way she laughed when he said something dry and unexpected, a genuine bright laugh that he catalogued and treasured each instance of. In February, when the worst of the cold had eased slightly and the days were lengthening, he began a project. He had not told her about it. He went out after his morning rounds, on the days when the weather allowed, to a clearing on the southern slope above the cabin where the sun hit longest, and the view stretched all the way to the valley below. He had been thinking about it since December, maybe longer, the shape of it forming slowly in the back of his mind while he played card games and mended harnesses and tried to be patient. He began to build a house. Not the word house exactly. Not a frontier shack or a log hunter's station, which was what most men in his position would have considered adequate. He was thinking about something else entirely, something that he could not have articulated as a plan at the outset, but that was clear to him in the way that things were clear to him in the mountains, by feel and instinct and long understanding of what materials would do. He wanted to build something worthy of her. He did not tell her this. He told her he was extending his supply storage, which was not a lie exactly, since the new building would eventually serve many purposes. He rode down to the trading post in Downeyville in early February and spent more money than he had spent on himself in several years on good timber and hardware, loading it onto the pack mule and hauling it up the mountain in 3 trips over 2 weeks. The trader, a man named Purcell, who had known Elias for years, looked at the quality and quantity of what Elias was purchasing and said, "You building a town up there, Croft?" "Something like that," Elias said. "You get married without telling anybody?" Purcell asked, because Purcell had a radar for these things that Elias found mildly irritating and completely accurate. "Mind your business, Purcell," Elias said, but he said it without any real heat, and Purcell grinned at his back as he left. He worked on the building whenever Lin Mei was occupied with other things and the weather allowed, which in a Sierra Nevada February meant he worked in cold that numbed his fingers inside their gloves and sometimes had to stop because the light failed or the wind picked up to the point where working safely was not possible. He did not mind. The work gave him something to do with the feeling that had been building in him since October, the same way carving gave him something to do with the long evenings. He poured himself into the timber frame and the floor joists and the careful measurements, and he found that the more he built, the clearer his idea became. And the clearer his idea became, the more he wanted to be finished. Lin Mei knew something was happening. She was too observant not to. She noticed the extra trips outside, the sawdust that appeared on his jacket sometimes at odd hours, the particular set of his expression when he came in from the cold that she had come to associate with the satisfaction of work going well. She did not ask. She had an instinct for the things he was not ready to talk about and a respect for those instincts in others that came from having many such things herself. March came, and then April, with its alternating weeks of late snow and sudden warmth and the first wildflowers appearing in the south-facing meadows while the north-facing slopes were still white. Lin Mei's ankle had long since healed to full strength, a fact that she tested each day on walks of increasing length, sometimes with Elias, sometimes alone, always returning with the particular look on her face that he now recognized as the look she had when something had moved her, and she was deciding how much of it to share. They went to Downeyville together in April, the first time Lin Mei had been off the mountain since October. Elias had business with Purcell, supplies to collect, and he had asked her to come with a directness that had nothing in it of the tentative. She rode his second horse, a steady Appaloosa mare called Clara, with a competence that surprised him, and then she explained when he looked at her that she had ridden before, that her father had sometimes borrowed horses for the Sunday his employer grudgingly allowed him, and they had ridden in the hills east of Sacramento. Downeyville, in April, was a busy, noisy, cheerful mess of a small town, miners coming and going, freight wagons churning the main street to mud, the saloons doing their steady business, women hanging washing, children dodging horses. Lin Mei rode into it beside Elias with her back straight and her eyes taking everything in with the precise attention she gave all new environments, and he watched people watch her. some with curiosity, some with the particular fixed expression that he recognized as hostility and that made his jaw set. At Purcell's trading post, a man he did not know made a comment, not to Lin Mei directly, but loudly enough to be intended for her hearing. Something short and ugly about what Elias figured was her being Chinese, in a place that certain men felt entitled to designate as not for her. Elias heard it and set down the rope coil he had been examining, and turned to look at the man with an expression that had no anger in it at all, which was, in Elias's experience, considerably more alarming than anger would have been. "I did not hear you correctly," Elias said, very quietly. The man was not small. He looked at Elias, all 6 feet 2 inches and 220-odd pounds of contained mountain man, and the calculation he performed was visible on his face. He said nothing more. He found somewhere else to be. Purcell, behind the counter, busied himself with the inventory ledger with an expression of studied neutrality. Lin Mei, beside Elias, had not moved or changed her expression, but her hand had found his briefly and her fingers had pressed his for just a moment. "I do not need defending," she said quietly as they left the store. "I know that," he said. "I did it for me." She looked at him. "For you," she repeated. "Because some things I cannot let stand," he said. "Not because you cannot handle them, because I cannot." She was quiet for a step or two. "That is a distinction I can accept," she said. They were on the road back up the mountain, both horses loaded with supplies, when she asked him what he was building on the south slope. He looked at her. The afternoon sun was on her face, and the mountain air had put color into her cheeks, and she was watching him with those clear, dark eyes and waiting. "A house," he said. "A house," she said, "not a storage building." "No," he agreed. "For whom?" He stopped his horse. Clara stopped obediently beside him. They were on a narrow mountain road with the pine forest falling away below them and the high peaks white and enormous against the blue sky above. And Elias Croft, who had spent 11 years in these mountains learning the particular courage of solitude, found that what was required of him now was a different kind of courage entirely. "For you," he said, "or for us if you are willing to think about it that way. I know that is a thing that requires a great deal of consideration, and I am not asking you to decide anything today. But I wanted you to know what I was doing and why." The silence that followed was long enough that he began to wonder if he had said it wrong, or too much, or not enough. She was looking at the mountain above them with an expression he could not read, and he waited with the patience he had promised her, letting her take the time she needed. "Show me," she said finally. "Take me to see what you are building." They turned the horses up the slope. The clearing on the south face opened before them as the trees thinned, and what was there was not yet finished, but was enough to see the shape of it, the foundation solid and level, the timber frame rising clean and squared against the sky, the dimensions of it considerably larger and more carefully proportioned than any supply building had a reason to be. He had put in a row of window openings on the south wall, wide ones, positioned to catch the maximum light, because she read and sewed, and because the light at this elevation on a clear day was one of the mountain's most extraordinary gifts. She got down from Clara and walked through the frame, stepping over boards and sawdust, touching the timber uprights, looking at the spacing of the windows, examining the floor plan that was legible even in its skeletal state. She was very quiet and very thorough, the same way she approached everything. When she had completed her circuit, she stood in what would be the main room and looked at him. "The windows are for reading," she said. "Yes," he said. "You planned this in the winter," she said. It was not a question. "December," he said. "Maybe earlier." She looked at the window openings and at the space around her and at the mountain view that poured through the open south wall. "It is going to be beautiful," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not her usual careful composure, something that was more open than that and more vulnerable, and it made him want very much to close the distance between them. "You are not opposed to it," he said. She looked at him. "Elias," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name with that particular tone of voice, the one that put the whole weight of her full attention behind it. "I spent my whole life watching my parents build the best version of what they were allowed to build. I have never had anything built for me." She stopped. "I am not opposed to it. I am so far from opposed to it that I do not have a word for the opposite." He crossed the floor and took her face in both of his large, careful hands and kissed her, and the mountain around them was absolutely still. Spring moved into the high country with its usual breathtaking speed. The snowmelt rushed down every ravine, and the wildflowers took the meadows by storm, and the air smelled of pine resin and cold water, and the very particular green of new growth. Elias worked on the house every day now, without concealment, and Lin Mei worked on it with him. She had opinions about the interior, precise and well-reasoned opinions, and he listened to every one of them and incorporated the ones that made sense, which was most of them. She designed the kitchen with a specificity that reflected everything she understood about efficiency and the management of heat and the proper storage of ingredients, which was considerable. She had a bookshelf built into the wall of the main room, not a shelf, but a full built-in case with a ladder rail, with enough space for 300 volumes. He looked at this specification and looked at her. "We have 30 books," he said. "We will have more," she said. He built the bookshelf. She designed a covered porch facing south, wide enough to be an outdoor room in summer, with a railing along the edge at the right height for leaning on and looking at the valley below. This was entirely her idea, and it was a good one. He built it exactly as she specified. The hardware from Downeyville was good, but she wanted things for the interior that Downeyville did not carry: carved wooden details, decorative tile work around the fireplace, a particular kind of matting for the floor of one room. He rode down to Sacramento in May, a 3-day round trip on his big sorrel horse, and came back with a pack mule loaded with things, some of which he had found in the Sacramento Chinatown, because she had described them to him in such specific detail that he knew where they would be found. He described the Chinatown to her that evening, with the kind of careful thoroughness that told her he had paid very close attention, because he had known it would matter to her, and she listened with an expression that moved through grief and warmth and love in quick succession. "You went to Chinatown," she said. "To find what you wanted," he said. "People stared at you," she said, "because a man who looked like Elias Croft would have been conspicuous." "People stare at you in Downeyville," he pointed out. "I expect I can manage being stared at." She was quiet for a moment. "What was it like?" she asked, and he understood the question precisely. Not what were the shops like, but what was it like, being that far from your own known world, being looked at as foreign, navigating somewhere that did not expect you? "Humbling," he said honestly, "in a good way." He paused. "I bought this," and he produced from his pack a small book, a collection of classical Chinese poetry in a dual-language edition that he had found in a bookshop tucked behind a herbalist's stall, the English translations rough, but the Chinese characters on the facing pages clean and precise. He set it on the table in front of her. She picked it up and opened it. She was quiet for a long moment, running her finger along the characters. When she looked up, her eyes were bright. "You bought me poetry," she said. "I bought you poetry," he said, as though it were the most ordinary thing in the world. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. June was warm and bright, and they were often outside, working on the house in the long, clear days, and sometimes simply being in the mountains in the way that both of them had come to understand as one of the deepest pleasures of their particular life. They climbed to the lake above the tree line that he had described to her by firelight in the winter, taking 2 days for it with camp gear and provisions, and when they crested the last ridge and the water lay before them in its impossible blue-green perfection, he watched her face. She stood absolutely still for a full minute, looking at it, and then she turned to him with a radiance that he thought was one of the finest things he had ever been the recipient of. "You said you had no word for it," she said. "I still don't," he said. "In classical Chinese there is a term," she said, and she told him what it was and what it meant, something about a color that exists only where water is both deep and clear, where the sky is inside it and the mountain is inside it at the same time. "It is not quite right either," she said, "but it is closer." "It is much closer," he agreed. They sat on the shore in the afternoon sun, and she read him some of the poetry from the book he had brought from Sacramento, reading the Chinese aloud first, the sounds of the language formal and musical and strange to his ear, and then reading the English translation, and the difference between them was instructive in itself, the way something is always lost and something is always found in the crossing between languages. "Your family would have liked this place," he said, and he said it carefully because he was never sure how she wanted her parents spoken of. She looked at the water. "My mother would have wanted to sew the color of it," she said. "She would have found the silk." A pause. "My father would have wanted to know the depth of it. He was always measuring things. He said that in China the rivers had been measured and named for 10,000 years, and that here nothing had been measured long enough to trust." She smiled slightly. "He would have approved of you measuring things before you built them." "He sounds like a careful man," Elias said. "He was," she said. "The world was not careful with him." Elias was quiet for a moment. "I will be careful with you," he said. "I intend to be careful with you for as long as you will allow it." She looked at him. The blue-green light of the lake was on both their faces, and the silence was so clean it was almost visible. "That sounds," she said slowly, "like a proposal." He looked at the water. "It does, doesn't it?" he said. "I had not planned to do it quite this way." "How had you planned?" she asked. "I had not, specifically," he admitted. "I was waiting until the house was finished." "The house will not be finished until September," she pointed out. "That's a very long time to wait for an answer," he agreed. She turned to him fully and looked at his face, that big, handsome, sun-browned face with the amber eyes that were so much more readable than he imagined they were. And she thought about her parents and their careful, limited life, and the cruelty of a world that had given them so little margin, and how she had promised herself, in the weeks after her mother died, that she would not live a diminished life out of fear. She thought about this cabin and this man and this mountain and the bookshelf built for 300 books they did not yet own. "Yes," she said simply. He looked at her. "Yes," he repeated. "Yes," she said again, and she was smiling. He put his arms around her there on the lake shore, above the tree line, with the water that had no name laid out before them in its impossible color. And she leaned into him with her whole self, and he held her in the high afternoon sunlight and felt something settle in him that had been restless for 11 years. They were married in July in Downeyville, in a small ceremony at the office of the Justice of the Peace, a practical man named Hollis, who performed these things without ceremony or judgment. Purcell and his wife attended as witnesses, and Mrs. Purcell cried in the uncomplicated way that certain women cry at weddings, regardless of the specific details. And Purcell shook Elias's hand and looked at Lin Mei with a respect that had been developing since he had first seen her ride into his trading post in April with her back straight and her eyes clear. There was no church and no reception and no wedding dress, though Lin Mei wore a blue silk jacket that she had sewn herself over the winter, a deep, brilliant blue that was her own color and nobody else's. Elias wore a clean shirt and his best jacket and had clearly made an effort with his hair. Lin Mei, who had seen him in every state from soaking wet to covered in sawdust, thought he looked extraordinary. They rode home through the July mountain afternoon, up the long familiar trail, and the summer light came through the pines at that particular golden angle it achieves in the Sierra Nevada in midsummer, and the horses moved easy and unhurried, and nothing needed saying. The house was finished in late September. It had taken them the better part of 9 months from the first rough frame to the final detail work, and the result was something that neither of them had had a complete picture of at the outset, the whole always being larger than the plans. It was built on the south slope in that sun-catching clearing, 2 stories of squared timber with a wide covered porch along the front, 6 windows on the south face positioned to catch light at every hour of the day. The interior had the bookshelf Lin Mei had specified, full and floor to ceiling and already half filled with volumes that had been arriving on pack mules in 1s and 2s all summer. The kitchen was exactly as she had designed it. The fireplace surround had the decorative tile work she had asked for, blue and white tiles that Elias had sourced from a supplier in San Francisco through Purcell, tiles that were not precisely Chinese, but had in them something of the ceramics tradition that Lin Mei's mother had kept a fragment of in their Sacramento home. The porch faced the valley and the mountains beyond, and in the morning the light came across the peaks and hit the valley below in long, clear sweeps that changed minute by minute as the sun rose, and in the evening the same valley turned amber and then rose, and then a deep violet blue that had the quality of something that should be witnessed rather than merely seen. Purcell came up the mountain in October with his wife and 2 other trading post families from Downeyville, because Elias had mentioned in passing that the house was finished, and Purcell had construed this as an invitation. Mrs. Purcell stood on the porch and looked at the valley view, and then walked through the rooms and came back to the porch and said, "Elias Croft, I have known you for 7 years, and I had no idea you had this in you." "I had considerable help," Elias said. Mrs. Purcell looked at Lin Mei, who was in the kitchen producing a quantity of food that seemed impractical for the number of people present, until you understood that she was incapable of producing less than the best version of any given thing. "I should say you did," Mrs. Purcell said, and she said it warmly. The men stood on the porch with their coffee and looked at the valley, and Purcell said to Elias, quietly enough that it was a private conversation, "You built her a palace." "I built us a home," Elias said. "Same thing," Purcell said. Word traveled the way word travels in isolated mountain communities, which is completely and without encouragement. By November, most of the Downeyville Basin knew that Elias Croft, who had been a solitary figure in the high country for more than a decade, had married a Chinese woman named Lin, and had built a house on the south slope of the mountain that people were calling, with varying degrees of irony and admiration, the finest private residence in the county, above 3,000 feet elevation. Some people came up the mountain out of curiosity and were received with the particular combination of warmth and self-possession that Lin Mei brought to every interaction. Some people stayed away out of a hostility that neither Elias nor Lin Mei was surprised by or spent much time on. One family from the valley below, the Hendersons, became genuine friends, partly because their daughter Clara was a reader of the same dedicated type that Lin Mei was, and partly because Henderson himself was building a house and had heard that Elias Croft had done something unusual with his floor joists and wanted to understand the technique. He came up in November and learned about the floor joists and stayed for supper, and left in the evening saying that his wife would never forgive him if he did not bring her to see the kitchen, and in this prediction he was correct. It was Mrs. Henderson who said it most directly, standing in the main room with the fireplace and the bookshelf and the winter light coming through the south windows. "This does not look like anything up in these mountains," she said to Lin Mei. "I do not mean that as anything except admiration. It looks like something a person built for another person. Do you know what I mean?" "I know exactly what you mean," Lin Mei said. The first winter in the new house was different from the first winter in the cabin, different in every good way. The rooms were large enough for 2 people to be in the same space, and yet separate from each other, which they had both needed more than they had known during the cabin winter, and they arranged themselves in the new space with a naturalness that came from having already learned each other's patterns. He worked at a bench he had built in the front room. She sewed and read, and occasionally worked beside him at the same bench on her own projects, and the sound of both of them occupied with their hands in the same room was a sound that Elias, if pressed, would have described as contentment given an audible form. She was teaching him Chinese. It was a project she had proposed in December with the same practicality she brought to everything, suggesting that since she was already bilingual, the household might as well function in 2 languages. He was not a natural language learner, but he was persistent, and by February he had a working vocabulary of several hundred characters and a pronunciation that Lin Mei described as earnest, but not yet precise, which he understood to be her version of encouragement. In return, for reasons that neither of them had specifically articulated, he had begun teaching her carpentry. She had expressed an interest in the walnut chair he had been carving the autumn he found her, and the interest had widened, and by December she was working a piece of cedar on her own, feeling her way through the grain with a focus that was recognizable in her as the focus she brought to anything she decided to master. Her hands were precise and patient, and she had a natural feel for the grain that he told her honestly was better than his had been after 3 years. "I had a good teacher," she said. "You had adequate material," he said, which made her laugh. In March of 1874, Lin Mei told Elias she was expecting a child. He was at the kitchen table when she told him, and the coffee he was holding did not quite make it to his mouth. He set it down. He looked at her face, which was watching him with the characteristic attention, and he said, "Are you certain?" I am certain, she said. He stood up from the table, all of him in motion at once, the way large men are sometimes when something has reached them past their ordinary composure, and he crossed to her and put his hands on her face very gently and looked at her for a long moment before he said anything. Are you well? He asked. I am well, she said. Elias. Breathe. He breathed. He sat back down. He ran a hand through his hair, which had grown even longer over the winter and was currently extremely unruly, and looked at her with an expression that she thought was the most unguarded she had ever seen on him. A child, he said. A child, she confirmed. In November, he said, calculating. October, she said. I believe October. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table in front of him, and then he looked up with that rare, wide smile of his and said, We are going to need another bookshelf. She sat down across from him and laughed, genuinely laughed, the Fulbright version, and across the table their hands found each other and held. The pregnancy changed the household in the practical ways that pregnancies do, and in some less predictable ways besides. Lin Mei was not, by nature, a person who accepted limitation easily, and the particular fatigue of the early months irritated her profoundly. She managed it with the same systematic efficiency she brought to everything, organizing her days around the hours when she felt best, adapting her work accordingly, and accepting the adaptations without drama, but not without commentary. I am tired of being tired, she told Elias on a March evening when she had fallen asleep at the supper table and woken to find him quietly washing the dishes. I know, he said. It is biologically inconsiderate, she said. Deeply, he agreed. You do not have to wash the dishes, she said, not at all meaning it. I am aware, he said pleasantly. She watched him for a moment. Thank you, she said. Always, he said. By April, she had her energy back and she used it as she had always used it, with a purposeful totality that made Elias tired just watching. She had undertaken a project over the winter that she revealed to him in April. She was writing down her parents' story. Not a formal document exactly, but a careful account of what she remembered and what they had told her and what she understood about their journey from Guangdong to Sacramento and the life they had built there. She wrote in both English and Chinese, alternating in a way that let each language carry what it was best suited to carry, and she showed it to Elias in April, not for his approval, but because it had reached a stage where it felt larger than she could hold alone. He read it carefully. He sat at the table with it for a long time, turning the pages with a slowness that was about attention and not hesitation. When he finished, he set it down and looked at her. This is extraordinary, he said. It is incomplete, she said. It will be complete when it is complete, he said. What is here is extraordinary. He paused. Your father measured everything. He measured everything, she confirmed, and her voice had both sorrow and love in it. Put this in the bookshelf, he said. It belongs there. She did. She bound the pages between two pieces of cedar board and set it on the shelf between the Chinese poetry collection and the Dickens, and the act of placing it there had the quality of something that mattered. Summer came again, the second summer. The house was fully inhabited now, full of the small evidence of two people making a life. The growing bookshelf, tools and projects and half-finished things, the garden that Lin Mei had put in on the south slope below the porch, a small kitchen garden that produced, improbably but reliably, the vegetables and herbs that she wanted for her cooking. Elias had built her a cold storage cellar and a root cellar and a smokehouse, because a house this size in the mountains needed all of those things and because building was his version of saying things he did not have words for. Henderson came up the mountain in June with his wife and daughter, as they had taken to doing periodically, and stood on the porch with Elias while Lin Mei and Mrs. Henderson had the kitchen conversation that was apparently inexhaustible. Henderson was a man of few words and great practical intelligence, and he looked out at the valley for a while before he said, People down in the valley talk about this place. I expect they do, Elias said. The Chalmers family does not approve, Henderson said. He said it neutrally, as a fact. The Chalmerses were the largest landowning family in the basin, with the particular entitlements that came from being that. The Chalmers family's approval has not featured largely in my plans to date, Elias said. Henderson smiled at this. The younger men, the miners who come through, they talk about it as though it were a story. Some man in the mountains who built a palace for his Chinese wife. "It is a house," Elias said. "I know that," Henderson said. "But from down there," he nodded at the valley, "with the way the light hits it in the afternoon, it looks like more than that." He paused. "I think it is a good story for people to hear. The kind people need." Elias considered this. He looked at the valley spread below them, the basin of the Yuba River in the summer haze, the distant peaks still white, the immediate meadows richly green. He thought about what it had been when he came here at 19, and what it had become by the time Lin Mei had limped out of the forest into his life, and what it was now, in this moment, on this porch, with her voice coming through the kitchen window, and the child coming in October. "Tell them whatever they need," he said. October arrived with a golden ferocity, the aspens on the lower slopes blazing orange and yellow, the mornings cold and bright, and the afternoons briefly, warmly, autumnally perfect. Lin Mei had arranged the practical matters of the birth, with the same methodical preparation she brought to everything. Mrs. Henderson would come to stay for the last 2 weeks of the month as the nearest reliable company with experience of childbirth. There was a doctor in Downeyville who had confirmed the pregnancy and was prepared to make the mountain ride if needed, though the distance made him more of a last resort than a first option. Elias had prepared the house for every contingency he could think of, and several he probably did not need to think of, because the alternative was standing still while his wife carried his child toward October, and standing still was not available to him. On the 3rd of October, in the early morning, before the sun had cleared the eastern ridge, Lin Mei woke him with a hand on his shoulder. He was awake before his eyes were fully open, one of his mountain habits. She told him calmly that it was time and that she was going to need Mrs. Henderson, who was already installed in the spare room, and that he should put water on to heat because that seemed to be universally required and was at least something useful he could do. He put water on to heat and fetched Mrs. Henderson and came back to the kitchen and stood at the window and watched the sun come up over the eastern ridge, while the sounds from the back of the house told him nothing useful and everything terrifying in equal measure. He was not a man who panicked. He was not a man who panicked under any mountain circumstance he could recall. He discovered that this particular circumstance was not a mountain circumstance, and that his mountain composure was not entirely adequate to it. He kept the fire going. He kept the water hot. He went outside twice and split wood that did not need splitting. Just before noon, Mrs. Henderson came to find him. She was smiling. He walked back into the house with the same controlled urgency he used approaching anything unknown in the mountains, and he found Lin Mei sitting up in their bed with a small furious person on her chest. And the small furious person had a remarkable quantity of dark hair and was making his feelings about the situation abundantly clear. And Lin Mei was looking at him with an exhaustion and a radiance that Elias thought were not two separate things, but one complete thing. "A son," she said. He sat on the edge of the bed. He looked at the child with the same overwhelming attention he had given to very few things in his life. He was tiny and remarkable and red in the face and deeply unimpressed with everything around him. Lin Mei put him in Elias's hands, and Elias held him with the instinctive care he had used, holding the stunned bird in the winter, all that great capable strength turned entirely toward protecting this smallest of things. "Hello," he said quietly to the child. The child, temporarily exhausted by his own fury, looked up at him with dark, unfocused eyes. Lin Mei was watching Elias's face. She thought she had never seen him look like that before, and that she would remember this particular look for the rest of her life. "What shall we name him?" she asked. He had thought about this, of course, because he thought about things in advance. "Thomas Way Croft," he said. He had looked up what way meant. It meant greatness, and it meant the thread that runs through everything. "If you agree," she looked at the child and then at him. "I agree," she said. "Way Thomas." "Thomas Way," he said. "We will compromise," she said. He laughed, and the baby startled at the sound and waved one tiny, furious fist, and Lin Mei said, "You are going to have to learn to laugh quietly." And he laughed again, helplessly. And Mrs. Henderson came back in from the kitchen with tea and looked at the three of them and felt, strongly, that she had walked into something that was not quite available to other people. Thomas Y. Croft was, from his earliest weeks, a child of strong opinions, which surprised no one who knew his parents. He had his father's lungs and his mother's eyes, and an expression of focused assessment that he had apparently been born with, and that made adults feel, slightly uncomfortably, that they were being evaluated. He was also, once the assessment phase was complete, a child of extraordinary warmth, given to sudden fierce hugs and an infectious delight in small things that Elias found, to his considerable surprise, the most moving quality he had ever encountered in another person. He was 3 months old the first time Elias carried him outside in the deep snow of January, bundled against the cold, and held him up to look at the mountain. Thomas stared at the white slopes with an expression of pure concentration, and then made a sound that was not quite a word, and put one fist in the direction of the peak, as if pointing. Lin Mei, watching from the porch doorway, said, "He is already making plans." "He gets that from his mother," Elias said. Winter passed, and Thomas grew with the speed of mountain springs, which is to say dramatically and all at once. By his first summer he was crawling at a pace that made perimeter management something of a full-time project, and by the following spring he was upright and moving with the determined velocity of someone who has somewhere specific to be, and has not been told he cannot get there yet. He followed his father everywhere. This was both deeply satisfying to Elias and somewhat complicated, since the places Elias went in the course of his days included several that were not entirely suitable for a toddler with an enthusiasm for direct experience. He adapted his routes and his habits with a willingness that would have surprised anyone who had known him before October of 1872, and the adaptation seemed, to those who observed it, entirely natural. Lin Mei continued her writing. The account of her parents' life had grown into something larger, a broader history of the Chinese experience in California during the gold rush years and the railroad era, drawing on her parents' stories and on documents she had requested from Sacramento through the post, and on interviews she had conducted, in writing, with former acquaintances of her parents who were willing to contribute their accounts. Elias had arranged a correspondence with a Sacramento newspaper editor who was, provisionally and with considerable commercial caution, interested in the work. This project moved slowly, as large projects do, fitting itself around the daily life of the house and the child and the mountain, and it was better for the slowness, gaining depth and specificity as it went. On the evenings when she worked at the table on it, Elias made a point of taking Thomas for his bath and his bedtime story so that she had unbroken hours, and he did this without making it a thing that required acknowledgement, simply adjusting the evening's arrangement because it was the right thing, and because her work mattered, and because love, in his understanding of it, was largely about adjusting yourself around what mattered to the other person. The summer of 1875 brought two things of significance to the Croft household on the south slope of the Sierra Nevada. The first was a letter from the Sacramento newspaper editor expressing his intention to publish 3 of Lin Mei's historical accounts, under her name, as a series in the Sunday edition. She read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then set it down with both hands flat on the table, and sat very still for a moment, the way she sat when something large had arrived and she was making room for it. Elias was watching her. "Good news," he said. Not a question. She looked up. Her eyes were very bright. "He's going to publish it," she said, "under my name." Elias set down what he was doing and came around the table and put his arms around her from behind, his chin on the top of her head, and held on. "Your father would have been proud of that," he said. She put her hands over his. "He would have wanted to measure the column inches," she said, and her voice cracked very slightly on the last word, and he held her closer. The second significant thing was the arrival of the Chalmers problem. Old Walter Chalmers, who had made his views about the Crofts' marriage known through the reliable mechanism of other people's mouths for the past 2 years, sent a man up the mountain in August with a letter claiming a historical stake in the land parcel on the south slope where the house stood, a claim that was, as far as Elias could determine, entirely invented and designed to produce either a legal complication or the particular anxiety that legal complications induced. Elias read the letter twice, as Lin Mei had read her letter twice, and then he put it in his jacket and rode down to Downeyville. He came back in the evening with a counter document signed by Judge Morrison, who had reviewed Elias's original land claim papers and found them perfectly in order, and a second document which was the judge's written opinion on the Chalmers claim, which was composed in legal language, but whose substance was approximately that the claim was without merit. He put both documents on the table and said, "That is settled." Lin Mei read the documents carefully. "He will try again," she said. "He can try," Elias said. He was not belligerent about it, only certain. "The papers are clean. The claim is sound. He has nothing." She looked at him. "You're very calm about this." "Men like Chalmers rely on other men being afraid of them," he said. "I am not afraid of him. He is welcome to discover what that means." She looked at the documents and then at him, and the look she gave him had in it everything she thought about Elias Croft, and all of it was good. "I'm going to make dinner," she said, and she went to the kitchen, and he sat at the table with Thomas on his lap, showing him the shapes of letters in a picture book, and the evening settled into itself around them. Chalmers did not try again. The word came down through Purcell, a few months later, that old Chalmers had had a stroke, and that his sons, who had less appetite for their father's particular kind of hostility, were more interested in their mining concerns. The hostility in the valley diminished not because attitudes had changed, but because the person who had organized them lost his voice, and Elias noted this without satisfaction and without surprise. Some things improved because people became better. Others improved because the people who organized the worst of them ran out of time. Both outcomes were outcomes. More families came to know the Crofts over the following years. Some came up the mountain originally out of curiosity about the house, which had indeed become a kind of local legend in the way Henderson had described, and stayed because the Crofts were themselves interesting and generous, and because Lin Mei's table was something that people talked about long after they had eaten at it. The house grew incrementally, a new room in the summer of 1876 for the purpose that revealed itself in the late spring of that year. She told him on a May morning on the porch, with the same composure she had used the first time, but this time with a kind of ease that the first time had not yet had, a settled certainty in both of them that this was good and that they were ready. "Again," she said. He looked at her with the expression she had catalogued the first time, and that was now one of her most treasured possessions. "October again?" he said. "November," she said. "I believe November." He reached across the porch table and covered her hand with his. Below them, the valley was fully green in the May morning, and the peaks were still white, and Thomas, who was 2.5 and had recently discovered that the distance between the porch railing posts was exactly wide enough to consider squeezing through, was currently engaged in the testing of this hypothesis at the far end of the porch. Elias watched him and said, "Thomas, step back from the railing." Thomas stepped back from the railing with an expression of profound philosophical disagreement. Lin Mei watched this and then watched Elias watching Thomas, and felt something that she had felt many times since October of 1873, but never quite the same way twice, always slightly larger, always slightly more completely itself, the feeling that she was exactly in the right place. The new room was finished by August, and in November, with Mrs. Henderson again, present, and the doctor this time making the mountain ride because Lin Mei had specifically requested him. Their second child arrived in a long, difficult evening and an early morning, and came into the world with considerably less fury than his brother had, but with the same dark Croft family eyes. Another son. They named him Liang James Croft, Liang for strength, James for no particular reason, except that it sounded right with the rest of it. He was a quiet and watchful baby who observed his older brother's constant motion with an expression of scientific detachment and grew into a quieter and more self-contained child than Thomas, which made him, paradoxically, the one who could sit still long enough to learn carpentry at the age of 5. Thomas, meanwhile, was turning into a child who could track animals across fresh snow before he could reliably spell his own name, which his father thought was a reasonable set of priorities, and his mother thought was a negotiating position. Lin Mei's series in the Sacramento newspaper drew responses. Some were hostile in the predictable ways, more were not. Letters arrived addressed to her by name at the Downeyville post office, forwarded through the newspaper, and she answered each one in her careful English, factual and undeflected and warm. One letter came from a woman in San Francisco, Chinese, who had read the series and who wrote to say that her husband, who had worked the Transcontinental Railroad, had wept reading it. Lin Mei answered this letter with particular care, and the correspondence continued for years. In 1878, the Sacramento editor asked if she had material for a book. She did. She had been accumulating it for 4 years. In the careful, incremental way she accumulated everything, and the book was present in her files the way a fully formed thing is sometimes present, before anyone knows what to call it. She wrote to the editor that she would consider it. She discussed it with Elias over a week of evenings, his role in the discussion being primarily to listen and ask the questions that helped her hear what she already knew. "You want to do it," he said on the 4th evening. "I want to do it," she confirmed. "Then we make the space for it," he said. It was not a complex calculation for him. She wrote the book over the next 18 months, in the mornings before the household fully woke, in the long winter evenings by the bookshelf full of volumes they had accumulated, in the summer hours when the children were with Elias, learning whatever the mountain had to teach that particular day. It was published by a San Francisco house in 1880, a modest edition, not widely reviewed, but it existed. It was real. It had a spine and her name on it, and a place in the bookshelf between the Chinese poetry collection and the cedar-bound account of her parents' story. She held it on the day it arrived and did not say anything for a while. Thomas, who was 6, took it from her hands and examined it with the focused assessment that had been characteristic of him since birth and said, "It has your name on it." "It does," she said. "Can I read it?" he asked. "When you are older," she said. "Some of it is sad." "I like sad books," he said, with the profound authority of a 6-year-old. "I know you do," she said, which was true, because he had cried at a story about a horse and then immediately requested it again. Elias took the book from Thomas and looked at it, and then at Lin Mei, with an expression that she thought was the fullest version she had ever seen of him, all of him present, and none of it held back. "Lin Mei Croft," he said, just her name, but he said it the way he had said it on the morning she told him about Thomas, with everything in it. She crossed the room and kissed him, and Thomas said, "Disgusting," in the tone of complete satisfaction that children use when saying disgusting things, and Liang, who was 3, observed all of this from his spot on the floor where he was constructing something out of wooden blocks and looked up with the expression that meant he was filing it away for later consideration. The years on the mountain had their rhythm and their texture and their beauty, each season distinct and fully itself, each year adding something new without displacing what had come before. The bookshelf reached its capacity and he built another one. The garden expanded and they added a greenhouse, a small one, on the south side of the house where the light was best, because Lin Mei had discovered that growing things in winter was a pleasure she had not known about until she tried it. Thomas took to the mountains with his father with a completeness and a joy that was almost devotional, learning the names of everything, the plants and the birds and the weather patterns and the water courses, absorbing the knowledge of the high country the way he absorbed everything, totally and without apparent effort. Liang took to the workbench. By the time he was 7, he was making small things with a precision that Elias found remarkable, not just technically, but in the way he thought about what he was making, always asking what something was for before he made it, what problem it solved, what it needed to do. Lin Mei, who recognized this mode of thinking intimately, said once that Liang thought like her father. Elias looked at his younger son bending over a piece of pine with a small chisel and thought about a man he had never met who had measured the depth of a mountain lake and taught his daughter characters by lamplight after 12 hours of laundry work, and said, "That is a good thing to be." In the summer of 1882, the family rode down to Sacramento together for the first time. Thomas was 8 and Liang was 5, and Lin Mei had not been to Sacramento since before that October, in 1872, when she had climbed onto a stranger's wagon and made the decision that had ultimately delivered her to these mountains. She had been returning to it in her writing and in her memory for 10 years, and the physical return had a quality of completion to it that she had not been certain she needed until she arrived and understood that she did. Elias rode beside her through the city streets with the solid, unhurried presence that was his constant quality, entirely at ease with his own size and certainty in a city full of people who had never met anyone quite like him. And Thomas rode on his other side with his eyes taking in everything with the mountain man's instinctive assessment of new terrain, and Liang sat the horse with a composure that made people look twice at a 5-year-old. They went to the Sacramento Chinatown, which had grown and changed in 10 years. Lin Mei walked through streets that held in them the residue of her parents' lives, the laundry district where her father had worked, the street where their rooms had been, the mission school where she had learned to read English from a teacher who had recognized something in a child that the world was not yet prepared to honor. Some of what she looked for was gone. Some remained, changed. She walked through it all with Elias's hand around hers, and her sons walking ahead of her with the unconscious authority of children who have been loved securely. And she felt her parents in the stones of it, in the smell of the air, in the sound of the language, in the voices around her. She bought books, naturally. She bought a carved wooden figure from a craftsman whose work reminded her of something her mother had owned, and she bought spices for the kitchen, and she had a long conversation in Chinese with an elderly woman who had known her mother slightly, who looked at her and at her family, and said something that Lin Mei did not translate immediately. In the evening at the hotel, Elias asked her what the old woman had said. She thought about how to put it in English. She said my mother would be pleased with how the tree grew, she said. He was quiet for a moment. So would your father, he said. Yes, she said. So would my father. They sat on the small hotel balcony in the Sacramento evening, the city sounds coming up from the street below, so different from the mountain silence they had both come to understand as home. Thomas was already asleep in the next room with the absolute efficiency of a child who had been intensely alive all day. Liang had fallen asleep sitting up with a book in his lap, which was so characteristic that neither of them had found it surprising. I did not know when I found you in those woods, Elias said, what was happening. I only knew I needed to get you somewhere warm. She looked at him. I did not know what was happening either, she said. I only knew that you said you were not going to hurt me and that you meant it. I meant it, he said. I know, she said. I have always known. She leaned her head against his shoulder in the Sacramento evening, with the city below them and their children sleeping inside, and the mountains invisible but present in the north and east, the mountains that were home. I think about that morning sometimes, what would have happened if I had fallen on the other side of the ridge, or if you had taken a different trail. I think about that too, he said. Do you think it would have happened anyway? She asked. Some other way? Some other time? He considered it with the seriousness he gave to real questions. I don't know, he said honestly. I don't know if there is some other way. I only know this way. I only know that morning and every morning after it. She lifted her head and looked at him in the warm evening light, this large, sure, gentle man who had built her a house on a mountain and read her poetry in languages he did not fully understand, and held her sons in hands that could hew timber and spent 11 years alone in the wilderness, and had been, without knowing it, becoming the person who would carry her home from the floor of a forest. I love you, she said. She said it with the directness she brought to everything true, nothing diminished, nothing held back. I love you, he said. He said it the same way. Below them, the Sacramento evening moved through its ordinary miraculous business. Somewhere in the mountains to the north, the house on the south slope waited in the summer darkness, the valley below it in its summer green, the bookshelf full, the garden in its second growth, the porch facing the view that changed every morning and was never anything but extraordinary. They went home 3 days later, up the long, familiar trail, the four of them on horseback moving through the July light of the Sierra Nevada foothills. And as the elevation rose, and the air changed, and the sound of the valley fell away behind them, and the sound of the mountain took its place, Elias watched Lin Mei straighten in the saddle and breathe differently, the particular breath of a person arriving somewhere that knows them. Almost there, he said. Almost there, she said. Thomas, 8 years old and already half wild with the mountain in him, pushed Clara into a canter on the clear stretch of trail ahead, and they could hear him laughing in the trees before they could see him. Liang, on the horse beside his father, watched his brother disappear into the pines with the expression of a younger child cataloging a behavior he has not yet decided whether to emulate. The house came into view through the trees as it always did, announcing itself first through the gap in the pines where the south slope opened, the clean lines of it against the sky, the wide porch, the glint of the south-facing windows in the afternoon light. After 8 years, it was as familiar as breathing, and it still did something to Elias every time. A rightness. This is the thing I built for the right reason, the feeling he had never found a word for and had long since stopped needing one. Lin Mei saw him looking at the house, and then she saw him looking at her, and she understood the look perfectly, as she understood most of his looks by now, and she felt the same thing herself, the same rightness from her own angle, which was slightly different and entirely compatible. Thomas had beaten them there and was already on the porch, one hand on the railing, looking out at the valley with the instinctive surveyor's gaze he had been born with. "Home," he announced to no one in particular, with the pure satisfaction of someone who is exactly where they belong. Behind him the door of the house stood open, the interior smell of cedar and books and whatever was left of the last fire mixing with the mountain air. And inside the bookshelf waited with its 300 and some volumes, and the cedar-bound account of 2 people's lives, and the book with Lin Mei's name on the spine, and room for more of all of it, always more room, because Elias had built the shelves that way on purpose, and she had asked him to, and they both knew why. Liang climbed down from his horse with 5-year-old dignity, and walked up the porch steps and stood next to his brother, and looked at the valley. Thomas put an arm around his little brother's shoulders with the easy generosity of a child who had always had enough of everything to share. Elias dismounted and took Lin Mei's horse, and she stepped down, and they stood for a moment in the yard, looking up at the house, and she put her hand in his, and he closed his fingers around hers. The light on the south slope was doing the thing it did in the late July afternoon, the long, sweeping thing that made the valley look as though it were lit from inside, and the mountains beyond were every shade of blue and purple, and the air was the air of the high country in summer, which is its own specific and unrepeatable thing, clean and thin and full of the smell of pine and the cold of snowmelt in the creeks below the tree line. In the years that followed, the mountains kept their rhythm, and the house on the south slope kept its warmth, and the family grew in the ways that mattered most. Thomas grew into a young man who knew the Sierra Nevada the way his father had taught him to know it, and who carried something of his mother in the way he read the world, precisely and without sentimentality, and with a deep and specific love for what was real. Liang grew into a craftsman of genuine talent, trained first by his father and then partly by his own instincts. The furniture he made by the time he was 15, carrying in it the same quality of having been built for a reason that characterized the house itself. Lin Mei's correspondence with the woman in San Francisco deepened over years into a real friendship, and the historical work she had begun with her parents' story continued to grow, because there were always more stories, and she had made herself a keeper of them. Elias at 40 was not significantly different from Elias at 31, which is to say, he was still a man of large and quiet presence, still as broad through the shoulders as a barn door, and still given to the economy of motion and word that the mountains had confirmed in him. His hair was longer, and showed the first gray at the temples, and his face had deepened with the decade, the lines of it more settled, the amber eyes, if anything, more readable, as though age had worn away some of the surface, and what showed now was closer to the core. He had built things steadily over those years, as was his nature, each one designed for a specific purpose and built to last. A second greenhouse, a library alcove off the main room, because the bookshelf had overflowed twice, and he had reshelved it twice and understood that a proper expansion was required. A small workshop for Liang with its own good light and its own tool rack, arranged with Liang's characteristic precision. A new saddle bench for Thomas, who spent more time on horseback than off, and whose saddle maintenance was something Elias had opinions about and had eventually resolved by building a proper space for it. But the thing he was most proud of was the one he had built first, the house itself, the original structure that had been the expression of everything he had understood and not yet found words for in the winter of 1872 and 1873. It had proven to be exactly what both of them had needed it to be, large enough for a growing life and solid enough for a difficult one, and beautiful in the specific way that things are beautiful when they are made for love. Lin Mei, in her 40s, had a presence that people who met her for the first time found difficult to describe afterward. She was not formidable in the way that the word usually implies, not hard or imposing, but she was entirely herself, which was something different, something that took up its full space without apology or diminishment. She had stopped being careful in the protective way she had been careful when Elias first knew her, not because the world had become less complicated, but because she had become less willing to reduce herself in response to it. She still read everything she could get her hands on. She still cooked the way she did everything, with an exactness and a generosity that were not in contradiction. She still sat on the porch in the evenings with Elias and watched the light change over the valley and felt, each time, the particular gratitude of a person who knows exactly what they have and how it was arrived at. "Tell me something you have never told anyone," she said to him one October evening on the porch, the aspens burning in the valley below, Thomas away for the week at the Henderson place, and Liang inside with his projects. He thought about it. They still did this sometimes, the thing that had started in the firelight in the cabin the winter she healed. He was better at it now, 11 years of practice. "I was afraid," he said, "after that first winter in the cabin, when the ankle had healed enough that you could leave. I was afraid that was what you would do." She looked at him. "I could see that," she said. "You were very controlled about it." "I'm generally controlled," he said. "You are," she agreed. "I could see it anyway." She paused. "I was afraid, too, that the safety would end, that there would be some reason it had to end." "It did not end," he said. "It did not end," she said. "Tell me something else." He was quiet for a moment, the mountain being quiet around him as it always was in October. That particular held silence before winter. "I knew, when I carried you back from the forest," he said, "that something had changed. I did not know what. I knew something had changed." She looked at him for a long moment. "When I put my hand on your chest," she said, "and felt your heart, I knew too." The October light was on the valley and the peaks were white and the porch was warm from the day's last sun. Below them, improbably far and improbably beautiful, the world went about its immense indifferent business, and on the south slope of the mountain, in the house that had been built as an act of love and that had become the most complete version of the word home that either of them had ever known, Elias Croft put his arm around his wife, and she leaned into him, and the evening came on around them, golden and certain and full.